find such a love at our age. Whoever thought we could dance on a...
Welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'm your co-host, Judy Alexander, and I'm here with my husband, Dr. Bruce Chalmer.
Hello, Judy. Hello, viewers and listeners. Judy, what's today's topic?
My partner voted for them. What do I do? An interview with Matt DiGeronimo.
Yes, indeed. And I hope you will stay tuned and catch that interview. He's got some really good and I think important stuff to say. I already kind of, right in the interview early on, drew a connection between that and our interview a few weeks ago with Wilk Wilkinson.
It's in the zeitgeist. I think, we're looking for ways that we can talk to people with differences of opinions.
Yeah.
And talk with each other rather than butting heads.
Yes.
And lots of people out there have lots of great ideas, and that's one of them.
And that is, I am just encouraged by the fact that we're finding more people like that, and we're trying to be part of that story too. I think
we are
kind of repairing the world in that sense. So that's a good thing. Let's tout our books first.
Okay.
Just to remind people.
The first one that I'm touting is Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again.
And that's a highly related topic to what we're talking about
here.
Betrayal and Forgiveness.
It really is.
It's a lot about that.
A lot of things going on.
Another book that actually also came up in the conversation.
Yes, it did. It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong.
When I mentioned toward the end of our interview with Matt, he mentioned his experience with improv.
Right.
The notion of yes and I just happen to have a whole chapter in that book.
Yes,
It's Not About Communication, comparing the process of couples therapy with improv, and I think it's a very apt comparison. And then the, as you say,
book that started our podcast, Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back.
Get all of those wherever you get books, but I hate to say, but I'm saying especially on Amazon, because that's how Amazon tells other people about it, and that's how it works these days. Speaking of books available on Amazon.
There's The Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible by Laria Zilber.
Yes, Laria Zilber.
Laria Zilber.
Your Alter Ego. Beautiful book of erotica. So you can find those books you can just search for them. Search for those books and you will find them. Let's get on with our interview and we'll see you on the other side.
Our guest today is Matthew DiGeronimo. Matt describes himself as a writer, thinker, and operations executive who's far more interested in what matters than what's impressive. A retired Navy lieutenant commander with degrees in nuclear engineering and business, Matt spent 20 years aboard nuclear submarines, completing 6 overseas deployments and a boots-on-the-ground tour during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Matt is the author of 2 Amazon bestsellers, Extreme Operational Excellence and Dear Hunter, Letters from Father to Son. Matt, welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Bruce. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you. So we always like to start off with our guests by asking, how did you get into the work you do? Tell us something about your own journey. And of course, I'll add to that, there wasn't much in that intro that would explain to people why the heck are we having you on a Couples Therapy in 7 Words podcast, which of course will become evident for our listeners, but feel free to address any of that.
Yeah, so all our lives' stories are different depending on what lens you look through, right? So I'll choose to look through a lens that will make it clear how I'm here. I grew up as a kind of a thinker, a writer, a philosopher, but I was also very good at math and science. And sort of the way our society works is when you're good at math and science, you get pushed in that direction. So I kind of went into an engineering space. And I didn't really know what to do with my life. I could picture myself an English professor or a starving artist or a nuclear physicist. I just didn't know. Kind of an example of too many options are sometimes not a good thing. And I ended up in the Navy just as a way to get out of New Jersey and do something exciting. I loved it. Like you mentioned, I've done several overseas tours, but even then, I spent a lot of time just watching how people communicate and listening to what was not said, or what the subplot was. And when you put 150 people on a steel tube for months and months at a time, you get a really, if you're so inclined, you get a really interesting way to look at human dynamics. I think that just as much as I learned submarine tactics in that 20 years, I learned about people. And there's no, on a submarine, there's no going home. There's no calling a timeout. There's no, I mean, you're there,
Hmm.
period. And it just, the days repeat seemingly an infinite number of times. So when it comes to conflict resolution, like nothing goes away. It has to be resolved.
Mm.
You're going to see that person in 12 hours. If you have a conflict right now, well, 12 hours later, you and him are going to be right back in the same spot. And you're going
Mm.
to do that for hundreds of days at a time. So as someone who is inclined to think and write philosophically, it was an interesting experience for me. And then similarly, my tour in the Middle East, where um, kind of brought home what matters, right? So, when you see truly life and death in front of you, you remember that forever. And then you bring it with you into, at least I brought it with me into subsequent relationships in ways that have shaped how I communicate and how I view the world, right? So I think those are two sort of important things to mention. And then maybe the third one is that as a writer, um, and what a self-described patriot, when I did write some books, as you mentioned, and but since I've had the uniform off, I haven't really felt of use to this country. And I know that may be hard to hear or wrap your brain around, but when I was wearing a uniform, I knew what I was doing and who I was doing it for.
Mhm.
The day that uniform stayed on the hanger and not on my body, I began to lose my sense of purpose. And when I see a country that's as divided as we are right now, my instinct is to do something and to be involved, right? And what I've been working on for the past few months is not a political effort, but rather trying to take everything that I just kind of discussed in my life and shape it in a way that can say, like, hey, how can we start talking to each other again in meaningful ways? Because and we don't talk Republican to Democrat, we talk husband to wife, we
Hmm.
talk father to son. Like there is no 78 million people talking to 78 million people. We talk one to one, and that starts at the living room. That starts in the living room and at the kitchen table. And so I began a series of YouTube videos just talking about like, hey, we got to be careful here. Like we're down a path where there are topics that we are so divided, and I've seen it, and I think you probably have too. This topic just completely tearing apart families,
Oh yeah,
making
I've
people
I've seen it a lot in my
estranged.
practice. Yeah, yeah.
And personally, I think as a patriot, this situation reminds me of cave people sitting around a fire at night, and there's a noise from the brush, and everyone's head turns to that brush. And whatever danger comes from there, we're probably going to be okay because everyone is looking at it.
Mm.
The real risk is in the other direction where no one is looking. And that's kind of how I feel about this civil discourse discussion, in that, and I don't have to get into the details because all you got to do is turn on the news. But all of this madness that you see right now, that's the noise in the brush. And
Mm.
everyone's looking at it. And it may not be good. I mean, I don't want to see a bobcat jump out of the brush any more than you do. But we're all paying attention to it. The area that I don't think we're paying attention to is the inability to talk to each other about topics that matter.
Mm.
and seeing literally it tearing families apart.
Mhm.
Uh, and that's the fabric of our country. If you can't address what's happening around the kitchen table, well, you can forget what's going to happen to the country, right? Because
Yeah.
it all begins and ends there.
So it's, this is amazingly timely, of course, in terms of the events going on. For the benefit of our listeners, who knows when they're listening to this, on a podcast. We're recording
Sure.
this in early April of 2025. And it just so happens that one of our most recent podcasts, I guess, yeah, it is out. I think it came out a couple of weeks ago, was with Wilk Wilkinson, who's a guy who's part of Braver Angels. Are you familiar with Braver Angels? Do you know
Yes.
that group? Yeah. And of course, I'm curious if you want to sort of situate your work in terms of the sort of things they do. And of course, in particular, your discussion about, wow, helping people talk across the kitchen table, which is not the same thing as what Braver Angels is doing. They're doing it in a much broader setting. I wonder if you could address, like, how do you do that? How do you invite couples to be able to bridge that gap? That was a multi-pronged question, wasn't it? But go ahead and take
Yeah,
it where
there's a
you
lot
will.
of meat on that bone.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know how to tackle this, but I know it needs to be tackled.
Yeah.
And my perspective or my philosophy is like, hey, for me to feel useful, I have to stop asking questions and just go do something about it. So, for example, or not for example, but imagine for a moment that we are in a time of history that people will look back on and say, wow, remember 2025? I mean, that's when the wheels fell off the bus, right? And who knows how the story ends, but I think it's possible that 2025 is in the history books as the precipice of these things happening. And I'm not I'm not finishing that sentence. I'm saying it feels like we're at an inflection point to like our society, right? And so I think about my son. I have a 6.5-year-old son named Hunter,
Mm.
and I picture him or his grandchildren asking me, "Hey, in 2025, what did you do?" And I don't wanna say, "Well, you should have seen me on Facebook. I put I told them how it was, and then I changed my profile photo on Instagram, and, that was me. That
That'll
was
show them.
I wanna be able to say I did something, and so,
Mhm.
like, speaking up like this, putting those videos that I have on YouTube where I'm addressing this issue, and I'm in the process of creating a civil discourse online course on Udemy that focuses on, not civil discourse at any kind of, um, advanced level, but
Mm.
just between people. Like, how do
Mhm.
we and I don't th and what I'm learning, and I think this is intuitive to both of you, it may not be intuitive to the world, is that if we can learn to have these conversations civilly, it far extends beyond politics, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, these
Yeah.
are these are like these are varsity level, conversational skills that because what's happening, and I may be jumping ahead of ourselves here a little bit, but what I'm realizing is that if you look at the words that people are saying, that's not what the argument is about. Like,
Mhm.
this is a level deeper about identity and who we are as people, and so when there's this debate about Doge and people are like, wanna just they're gonna disown their brother over a disagreement here. It's not about government efficiency. Like,
Yeah. Right.
that's not the issue.
Mhm.
This is we've attached there's certain topics in our lives where we've attached identity to, and
Mhm.
now we're struggling to protect ourselves in what our brain perceives to be an all-out street fight.
Mhm.
And the more I've
Yeah, it's
learned
more
about this.
it's more
Sorry.
about tribal. It's sort of like which tribe you're in. And that's a great
That's right.
example, Doge. Even saying it, it's like, okay, so anybody listening to this is going to say, oh no, which way are they going to go? because if they're on one side, whichever side they're on, they're worried that, oh no, we're coming from the other side. It's funny, I'm in the middle of writing a newsletter, a Substack newsletter, my latest newsletter, where I'm going to be very clear. I start off with some really, I thought, nicely crafted rants against both sides, and then say, I'm not going to tell you where I am on one side, but I'm not going to tell you which one it is. I'm not mushy in the middle. I have definite, passionate ideas. Not going to tell you that. Can you sit with
That's
that?
great.
Can you possibly still listen to anything I have to say, not knowing which side of the divide I am? Now, people who know us would probably know which side I'm on, but whatever. That's it. We don't do that. We freak out. We go into, we click into ideology. I've written about that too. We click into ideology as opposed to ideas, and we can't hear ideas anymore because we're too busy
Right.
defending our ideology.
Well, and the more I've done, and by the way, my goal is to get through this podcast and have you and anyone who listens have no idea which side I'm on, because this is not about that. It's
Right.
in my assessment, and same thing with my YouTube videos. I talk a lot about, like, hey, we have to start talking to each other, and my
Mhm.
goal is for the listener to have no idea where, when I go into the ballot
Yeah,
box, what I'm voting for, because that's
yeah.
not the issue. That's the noise that everyone's looking at around the campfire. I want to talk about behind us where no one's looking, which is our ability to communicate,
Mhm.
but bringing it a little bit closer to kind of your readers' interests. One thing, this has fundamentally changed my relationship at home, and I'll tell you why. We're having a discussion with my wife, and and I just blurted out a phrase that came from a lot of this research and discussion, which has fundamentally changed that argument and every argument since then. And that argument was, look, I don't want to win. I
Mhm.
don't want to win. I'm not trying to get you to a point where you say, you know what, Matt, you're right and I'm wrong. Like, I don't want that. And I think that, like, that fundamentally changed that whole discussion. And
If she
even
believed you, if she believed you,
if she believes me. And if
and
I
it
think she
sounds,
did.
apparently she did.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's like, look, we are on the same team.
Mhm.
I've never been a part of a truly spirited, we'll stay in the political realm, discussion. I've never seen it where one person says, hold on. You're right, and
Mhm.
I'm wrong. And thank you for correcting me. I've
Yeah.
never
Never
seen
has
it.
happened, huh?
I've never
Well,
seen it.
yes, and well, so let me bring up now since we talked to Wilk Wilkinson, and one of Wilk Wilkinson is an interesting guy. He's a Christian conservative has been very critical, among other things. He was very critical during the pandemic of Dr. Francis Collins, who was the head of NIH, and they are now fast friends. And they still disagree and they smile about it. And they actually, they give talks together about how it is possible to disagree and not have it be, about, oh my God, you're on the wrong team and I have to hate you.
Right.
But one of the other things that Wilk Wilkins is involved with is a group called the Pro-Human Foundation. And they were founded or co-founded by a man named Daryl Davis, he's a black man who has gone to KKK rallies. And he now has, I think what was the number?
It's like over 200
200,
people.
200 people who've renounced white supremacy just from having had those conversations.
The
And
one-on-one conversation, like what you're talking
like what you're
about,
talking
is
about. And it wasn't about arguing and telling them they're wrong. It was actually about respecting them. And then they were able to say, oh, wow, maybe I need to rethink this, these assumptions I'm making. And they're not crazy. They had to have some other experiences. And he had the incredible courage to do that. I
Mhm.
don't know if I'd pull that one off.
It's a tough
But
one.
That's amazing.
yeah.
That's
So
amazing.
it's
And,
it
and
is it's along those lines you're describing.
and it sounds like his accomplishment was was two-pronged, right? He had the courage to be there,
Hmm.
but then he had the emotional intelligence to realize that a traditional debate of I'm right and you're wrong isn't going to go anywhere. It
Yeah.
never
Exactly.
has. I mean,
Yeah.
but yet it's like if you knew your hammer was never going to drill a nail in, it was never going to happen. And you've never done it personally, you've never seen it work. Why would you continue to try?
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
and
because you
that's
have a hammer,
all
that's why.
I get all the tools that we have, like, when I watch people and families and, couples and debate about these it's like all the tools they're using are designed to somehow get the other person to acknowledge that they're wrong,
Mm,
and it's like, if we know that's not gonna happen, then we have to do something different,
yeah.
Yeah.
you
So
know,
what's your
and
what is your
so
approach with that?
well, my approach is let's seek to understand before being understood.
Mhm.
So, if I can say, all right, stop. Like, I cannot wrap my brain around your position, but I'm a smart person and you're a smart person. And we seem to be able to live in this world effectively in every other regard, right? I mean, we,
Mhm.
we don't we don't argue about which direction the hinge of the door works, and we don't argue about which direction gravity works. And we seem to
Mostly.
be able we seem
Occasionally,
to
there are
be
people
able
who do argue that, but that's another story.
well, but we see, but on this topic, we are so far apart. So I am not going to try to convince you. I just want you to help me understand
Mhm.
why
Mhm.
you feel the way you do, and
Yes.
allow me to ask questions, not to attack you, but to understand it. Because on a more macro level, and again, I think it all starts in the living room, but the amplified effect of it is that you have 78 million people on either side
Mhm.
who do not understand what the other 78 million people are thinking.
Yes.
They just don't. And further, I don't see a lot of evidence of either side wanting to understand it. It's
Well,
like
you
they
yeah. You made an assumption, which I think is really important to bring out, because that way of talking with people you're describing, you can't fake that, and it's founded on something. And you mentioned it, but I want to really underline it. It's when you said, "Well, you're not stupid, and I'm not stupid." That's a really important proviso. You have to really believe that. And I go, I go around saying, preaching
Mhm.
this. It's practically I should have a pulpit for it. That it can't be true that the other 78 million people, whichever side you're on, are crazy, evil, or stupid. There's the occasional really bad
Craziness.
person and the occasional crazy person, and I suppose the occasional stupid person, although that's relative. But basically, not. There's reasons why people have different frames of reference, different experiences, and to try and understand that is indeed how those connections get made. That's how common ground gets found, but you can't fake it. And it's so interesting because to teach people communication techniques does not work that way. What they actually have to believe in their heart, in their gut, is, wow, I'm not crazy, but neither are you, and isn't that interesting? We have opposite positions here. Let me understand it better. And you may or
right,
may not convince me, but I really genuinely, because I know you're not nuts. And
right.
that's in terms of couples therapy, of course. Well, you need to hold up our merch. The,
Yeah.
it's called
That's right.
couples therapy in 7 words. Those are hold it up to the
That's right.
those are the 7 words. Be kind, don't
Yep,
panic, and have faith. The kindness means kinship, means we are on the same team. Don't panic is what people panic when they recognize, oh my God, this is an enemy. This is a bobcat in the brushes. And the way you can do that is what I call faith, and I'm using that term very broadly. I don't mean necessarily religious faith, but exactly what you said when you just said in passing, well, I know you're not stupid, to this imagined person you're talking to on the other side. That's a statement of faith that says, oh, wait a minute. It can't be that everybody's stupid, or it can't be that everybody's crazy, because we're not. So isn't that interesting? We have multiple possibilities here. Then you can understand. And
right.
and to facilitate that is that's important work indeed. It is interesting. Yeah, you're doing something I would count, and I have great respect for people who served in the military. But I also think what you're doing now has every bit as much importance for our country as serving in the military does. They're both important.
Well, thank you for that, and it gives me the feeling that I can answer that question to Hunter's grandparents or grandchildren
Yeah.
or his children,
Mhm.
my grandchildren. Like, what did you do? And it's like, well, I,
Mhm.
I really did try to get people to think and talk in a way that they, you know, on the aggregate, sort of lost the ability. And I guess you could argue whether we actually had it, and now it's just being put to the test. I suppose that's debatable. But one skill, and I call it um, pause, zoom, and walk. That where, once that happens, and just pause, just stop. And we're going to immediately zoom out until we have common ground, right?
Yeah.
So whatever the situation is, I promise you, if you zoom out enough, you'll realize, like, so if, again, I don't want to get into the specifics of policy, but I think example it might suffice. Let's say it's healthcare. Let's zoom out, and I promise you, we're both going to say we would like as many people to be healthy in this country as possible,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Like
can I add another one?
Sure.
I often like to point this out to couples. Sometimes a common point of reference, and with couples, sometimes this is kind of the only one you can find, is wow, this is uncomfortable, isn't it? We're having a tough conversation right now, aren't we? This is painful, isn't it? Sometimes they can at least agree on that. I really like that concept. Is yeah, zoom out to whatever level you have to get to that says, okay, we know we're starting from commonplace here.
Right.
Isn't it interesting? We diverge somewhere, but here we're in common. Yeah, I like that concept.
And at least then you can have, so, and it's to me, it's like, okay, now we can have a fruitful conversation to figure out where we diverge.
Yeah.
Because when the divergence gets so big, and I watch people talk, there's so many assumptions that are off and underlining, and it's like you're just wasting your time. You're not even close to each other. So at least when you come back here, and I can start where we agree, we could take one step. Well, that's why I say pause, zoom, and walk. Right? We can walk together and say, okay. So, for example, in order to do that, in order to make as many people in this country healthy as possible, let's talk about who are the responsible parties, right? We have the family, we have the communities, we have the schools, we have the government. And, maybe we can have a discussion about where we think the specific responsibilities lie
Yeah.
in those different stakeholders. And that, you're setting yourself up for one hell of a conversation, but at least it will be fruitful, and also you'll learn a lot about the other person, right? Because as
Yeah.
soon as you realize, like, oh, wait a minute, so you think the government should be doing, it's ultimately the government's responsibility, say, more than the family for, I don't know, preventative care or a healthy diet. It's like, oh, okay, so then I can foresee that we're going to have some differences down the road,
Yeah, you
because
find those places. Yeah.
that's a divergence here, and I would rather talk about this than allow it to get. I don't know if you could do it
Right.
in my screen, but where it gets so far apart, you can't even relate.
Yeah. Now, the work you are doing, it seems to me, again, I sort of abstracting even a step further, the to have the conversation, to have the goodwill enough to have the conversation implies a bit of agreement that that's a good idea. I'll bet it would be a good idea if we could have a conversation and end up feeling good about it, even if we end up realizing where we differ. And that assumption isn't always present. And I suppose I'm just thinking this now as I say it. One way of defining the extremes of whatever side you're on are when you get to the extremes, you've lost faith in the conversation. You've lost faith in the possibility of conversation. They're so out there, whoever they are, they're so crazy, they're so ill, they're so mean and rotten and whatever. You can't even talk to them. I hear that a lot with respect to very controversial topics.
Sure.
And to find people who are willing to say, boy, this is uncomfortable, but it can't be that everybody has ill will, at least on some level, we're all thinking, we should probably, peace is probably better than war, on that level.
Right.
Then,
My
but you
wife
have
and
to
I had
find
a
that. Yeah.
so I can share, if it's okay, I'll share kind of a personal experience recently with my wife and I. We just vacationed in Mexico. It was our first one-to-one vacation since Hunter was born, so 6.5 years, and we had a
Wow.
blast. And we
Congratulations.
were sitting at the pool, and I was reading an article on my phone about the rise of suicide rates among the specific demographic of white young males. And I said something like, I wonder if they feel because of all the energy that we've put forth to uh, bridging social equity gaps is maybe an unintended consequence is
Mhm.
that this group feels excluded. And
Mhm.
my wife, who is by her profession, she's a health equity community engagement worker for hospitals.
Mm.
Immediately, she made so many assumptions about where I was going with this
Mm.
that we found ourselves in an argument. And I was like, "Well, hold on, stop. I don't I have not at all, not once, said I disagree with DEI programs. Like,
Mm.
I was just stating a fact. I was sharing a fact that I read and then speculating as
Mhm.
to what might cause that.
Right.
And then you made a leap of so many different assumptions about where I was going with this
Mhm.
that we were, next thing you know, we're in an argument. And we kind of talked through it. And I got her to the point where she said, "Yeah, you're right. I assumed that, if I was agreeing with what you're saying at that level, you were going to try to lead me into a place where, you're trying to corner me into saying that, these programs are, ineffective or somehow discriminatory against, other groups."
Mhm.
And we're pretty, the two of us are pretty, not perfect because nobody is, and actually far from perfect, but we're pretty introspective about our own communications and our
Yeah.
own conversations. And it just dawned on me, like, if we're having that problem,
Yeah.
despite how much effort we put into it, like, I can only imagine what this feels like throughout the country on all these various topics that are causing this big divide.
Oh, yeah.
It, and again, I don't see a way of addressing it at a macro level. It has to be in the living room.
Yeah.
Right.
Whether it's with our spouse, our sons and daughters, our neighbors, our uncles, our nephews, and I don't see a lot of evidence of that currently working.
Mm.
So how how can you, not you personally, but couples that do have these vast differences, how do you bridge that? How do you get the couples to have these conversations where they not only survive but thrive when they have such differing opinions?
Yeah, so one of the things I've written about recently is discussing, like, the opinions that we have on what's going on in this country are really the issues are proxies for our values. So I think if we can, with our spouse, say, hold on, stop. This is the consequence of our values, and this is actually a great opportunity for us to learn more about each other. Because if we start with, and I contend, if we start with three questions: what we value, what we fear, and what we tolerate.
Mm.
If we can really understand that about each other, it will inform these conversations, in a more logical fashion, right? If I know um, that you fear injustice, and I'm actually willing to tolerate injustice because I fear government overreach,
Mhm.
well, at least we can have that discussion about our values
Mm-hmm.
without tearing each other's heads off about a policy and then not understanding
Yeah.
why we feel that way.
You know, as you're describing that, I'm immediately thinking of Jonathan Haidt's work in Moral Foundations. I don't know if you know that name,
Uh,
Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. I highly recommend it. He wrote a book, oh, it's 10, 12 years ago now, more than that, 15 years ago, called The Righteous Mind. He's written a few
okay.
other things since then, but he is a psychologist who's written one of the founders, I think, of the field they call moral foundations theory. It's exactly what you're talking, or very similar to what you're talking about. That idea that says, isn't that interesting? You could value certain things more than others, or fear certain things more than others. I really like your taxonomy there of, what do you value? What do you fear? What was the third?
Tolerate.
What do
Tolerate.
you
Yes,
tolerate?
tolerate, which is brilliant. Yes. Those things, um, differing degrees in certain thing, and you mentioned injustice, which is one of the moral foundations, sort of justice versus justice, as opposed to fairness, which isn't quite the same thing necessarily, as opposed to sanctity, which is another one, as opposed to authority, which is another one. I forgot, he has like five, I think five moral foundations. And the degree to which people indeed fear it or value it or tolerate it is huge in determining whether they're Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, whatever you want to say. And to understand that, and Jonathan Haidt described his own process in that book, where, he started out more or less politically oriented a certain way and emerged from that with a much more complex understanding. It's like, he can't label himself so easily anymore because he's
Right.
having this understanding of, oh, wow, all these other people with different who are coming out of different assumptions and different frames of reference, they're not crazy either. Isn't that interesting? So that's very, very much in accord with the stuff that you're talking about.
And I have to give some credit to a professor of mine during my MBA studies at University of Connecticut. His name is Dr. Palmer. He would do these exercises with us, and the takeaway was always hidden from us. Like, we thought we knew what we were doing, like why we were doing the exercise. And briefly, I'd like to explain one. He did it was a red herring on non-verbal communication. So he did like 20 minutes of PowerPoint slides about nonverbal communication, but it was all just a sleight of hand tactic. And then he said, okay, so now we're going to play a card game, and once we start playing, there'll be no talking and no writing anything down, right? So I'm going to give each table the rules on a piece of paper. You have a few minutes to figure out how you're going to play this game and how you're going to keep score without talking or communicating with words in any way, right? And then, and this is a group of highly competitive 20-some-year-olds, right? So everybody wants to win. And what I will do, this is Dr. Palmer speaking, after the end of 5 minutes, the person with the most points at each group will move to the next table, and the person with the least number of points will move in the opposite direction. So you'll have kind of winners moving to one way and losers moving to the other, right? So I remember playing, and okay, so the first round I didn't win. I stayed at my table. And we're playing, and the new person at the table, I guess it was just one. So however it worked, we got one person at the table, was like messing us up, because they're like, what are you doing? Like, and everyone's brain went to like, man, how stupid is this person? Well, fast forward, everybody was given a different set of rules. Each table had a different set of rules. And what followed was a discussion of, what did your instinct tell you? Did anyone think, oh, this person must be operating by a different set of rules? Or did your brain go to, how stupid is this person? Such a simple game. How could they be screwing it up? And everyone in the class, myself included, acknowledged that we were frustrated, and we immediately went to a bias that assumed this person was somehow less than. And nobody in the class suspected, well, maybe they're operating with a different set of rules.
Yeah.
And when I think of that in the context of today, or even multicultural interactions, I think of Dr. Palmer probably several times a week.
I love that example. I'm sure I'm going to use it with some couples, because that is very similar to what happens with couples. They will not recognize just something as simple but huge as gender difference. Men and women. Turns out we operate by different sets of rules that we don't know about so well. Or I think you probably know more about them than we do.
Well, we were just talking about that today with a couple where when she was telling her girlfriends about something.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, it comes up fairly frequently where there's a couple I'm working with and they're having issues, and then the man is offended that the woman talks to her girlfriends about it. And I have noted, not to mansplain to women, as I often
but mansplaining to the man.
But mansplaining to the man, it's like, yeah, women are like that. In other words, don't expect they're operating in your terms. They're operating according to different rules, which are perfectly fine rules if you think about it. But they're not leading to the same conclusions about what ought to be, quote unquote, private and what oughtn't. And if you try and enforce, male rules on women, it ain't going to work well. They're going to get pissed.
Right.
We generally don't like it when you get pissed. When things are going well, we like it better when you're smiling than when you're pissed. But of course, it's understandable that we piss you off a lot.
Mhm.
I say we, speaking for all men, which is a little bit arrogant, but there it is. So, that is, I really love that example. That's a great
And then
example.
the other thing I wanted to share is like, and I've done this a couple times, and it's interesting. And I think I stole it. I stole this idea from someone. I don't know who. It might have been like a Jeff Bezos type personality, but where when you reach an impasse, or when you have a situation where you kind of know that the chances of finding common ground are slim, force each other to make their best argument on behalf of the other person.
I've heard that
So
one. Yes. Yeah.
where like, and I've done this in business, and and recently, because of this sort of effort that I'm undertaking, I've explored it on a more personal level. But like, I need you to just give me your best defense of what your partner is saying.
Mm.
And and again, in the business world, um it's pretty powerful, and
Mhm.
it's just surprising how, with a little bit of, not, we're talking 5-10 minutes of preparation, you come up with something that really highlights this notion that there are many topics where reasonable people can disagree.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Reason does not lead. I think embedded in a lot of our mental facilities is that if you are reasonable and if you are logical, you will reach a singular conclusion.
Yeah, turns out not to be true. Yeah.
It's not true.
Jonathan Haidt talks about that as well, by the way.
Is that
He
right?
says we are not thinking creatures who feel, we are feeling creatures who think.
I
And
like
thinking
that.
is way more in the service of our emotions than the other way around. And that doesn't mean that one's more right than the other, but in terms of how that operates, we will come up with good reasons to defend how we feel without even realizing we're doing that. We're thinking, well, I'm feeling this because it's obviously logical.
Mhm.
And actually, no, it's obviously logical because you feel that way. And,
Right, and that's the confirmation bias too, right? Where
yes,
we will cherry pick information to
Mhm.
support our feelings.
yeah.
Exactly.
But even in absence of that, two very reasonable people thinking reasonably and logically on many, many topics can get to a completely different destination.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And if we don't admit that to ourselves, I think we get very frustrated very quickly, because we assume, well, look, I'm being logical here. So unless you can point a hole in my logic, you have to agree with me.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, no, I know that by definition of what logic is, in the purest sense, you may be right, but in the most human sense, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Even logic has its limits. I mean, if you look at Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that there any logical system is going to be incomplete. It won't you'll always be able to come up with something that you cannot prove or disprove logically. And that's I was, as a recovering nerd with frequent relapses, as I often noted, I often find that really interesting and rather comforting. So you said you have a course you're developing, or you have developed. So
Yeah, so I'm pretty
Is it
close. I think
available?
May 1st will be the launch date. It's on
ah,
Udemy, and just calling mastering the lost art of civil discourse, where it's about 12 modules, and we just kind of talk through the different tools, and we've mentioned a couple of them here, that need to be dusted off the shelf, like just the thing, like using silence, and not feeling the need to have to immediately respond or attack someone. Using I used to do improv when I lived in Kansas City, and anyone who has a passing knowledge of improv knows about the yes and, right? So
Mhm.
I have a chapter in one of my books about exactly that, about therapy as improv. And it
is
talks
that
all about
right?
sand. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, and very, very powerful, right?
Mm.
Or allowing people to say, okay, so you feel this way. How could others misinterpret what you're saying? How could,
Mhm.
how could this be misinterpreted? Or how could, is there anything that we might regret 3 months or 3 years from now if we go down that path? Anything at all? Are there any unintended consequences? And just, yeah, I'm kind of just, this is just a fire hose type explanation, but I take essentially seven what I consider essential tools and just explore them.
Mhm.
Just explore them in terms of, yeah, this is the tool. This is how it can be used. Give you examples of, and it's reasonable that a lot of my examples come from people like negotiation experts who are hostage negotiators, which is,
Mhm. Sure.
at first blush a little abrupt when you're talking about your own, kitchen table discussions. But the reality
From
is those people are trained in the highest levels of communication
oh
where
yeah.
they recognize how tightly entwined the human ego is with the
Mhm.
words that we choose to use.
Sure.
Yeah, from a lot of the couples I work with, the stakes feel that high. It's like, yeah, it isn't literally a hostage negotiation, but to some folks, they feel like they're in that kind of situation sometimes where it just feels so desperate that doesn't seem like hyperbole. It's like, well, yeah,
Right.
those same skills can be very useful. So how can people get in touch with you and find out about your courses and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, right now my main effort is on Substack. So there's a publication that I run on Substack called Beyond Platitudes,
Hmm.
and you can either search Beyond Platitudes or Matt DiGeronimo. Not many people with my name, so it's pretty easy to find. And it's a small but growing group of artists that are really there to support each other, just to support thinking differently, challenging assumptions, and it's become sort of a mental playground, and I'm pretty proud of it. So that would be my what I would kind of recommend people find me there. And then if I could just briefly, 2 days ago, I published my third book,
Ah,
which I can kind of put up right there. It's called
please do.
Actualization. And the idea briefly is that you're not too big. You don't need smaller goals. You need a bigger self.
Uh,
So like
Mhm.
there's a after my first divorce, I stumbled upon some guidance that has stuck with me. Is like stop looking for Mr. or Mrs. Right and start becoming Mr. or Mrs. Right.
Ah, I love that idea.
And
Yes.
that idea extrapolated into our lives is this book. Like, how do
Hmm.
you become the person who will naturally, you don't have to try to achieve your goals. It will just be a natural fit for the person who you can become.
Hmm.
mm.
Yeah. Well, we'll put some links in the notes for this episode.
Well,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much for doing
Thank you,
this.
Matt.
It was a great conversation. I appreciate you having me on.
Our pleasure. Welcome back. We hope you found some useful information from Matt and, put it to good use.
Absolutely. He's talking about lots of tools that will help people
Mm-hmm.
find their way across that divide. And it
Yeah.
can be a really scary divide
And
to be across.
if you're one of them having trouble with communicating, it sounds like this module that he's coming out,
Yeah.
this program that he's coming out with, might be good to use in your personal life or maybe in some organizational capacity.
Yeah.
So,
That story he told, I know I'm going to use that with some clients. The story he told about the exercise that Professor Palmer did when
yeah,
he
yeah.
was, where was it, Connecticut or something like
Connecticut, yeah.
that. And that's a teaser, folks. If you if you on the incredibly unlikely event that you skipped to the end and didn't just hear it. And you know what? If you did, I want to hear from you because I don't believe you exist. But if you did, let us know. Anyway, I think we're all set there, right? And what we need to say.
Well,
Oh,
that,
yes.
and if you would like to be on our podcast, or if you have a topic that you would like us to talk about on the podcast, you can go to our website, ctin7.com. That's CT as in couples therapy in 7.com.
Absolutely. Let us know. And let us know if you'd like to be a guest yourself. You can sign up for a time. And so until next time,
Remember, be kind
don't panic.
and have faith.